Welcome, everyone, to another episode of the Startup Junkies podcast. Thank you for tuning in from wherever and however you're tuning in today. We appreciate you and hope you will like, share, subscribe, tell your friends, tell your colleagues to tune in as well. My name is Caleb Talley. I am on the Startup Junkie team, and I'm joined by my co-host, Davis McEntire. Davis, how's it going?
It's going well. Going well. Glad to be back for another podcast.
Absolutely. And we are very pleased today to be joined by a special guest, a friend of the Startup Junkies, Sandra Hodzic. Sandra is the Director of Strategic Innovation and Design at the Government of New Brunswick. And we're excited to have her on today. Sandra, how's it going?
Great. It's so nice to be here and chat with you again about things that are near and dear to me. So thank you.
Yeah, we're super glad to have you back. For those of you who don't tune into the podcast, but might not tune into our virtual events, Sandra has led webinars for us and done an excellent job in that regard. And we're excited to have her back. So Sandra, tell us, what does strategic innovation and design look like at the Government of New Brunswick? How did you get there? And, I guess, what's that origin story look like?
Yeah, let's unpack that question. That's a lot of things in one. The origin story is I've been really interested in sort of improving the lives of disadvantaged and vulnerable people, sort of period. And I think that's what's led me into my path into government. And so I've always had that as my central vision. And then in the last, I would say about 10 years, I started getting really interested in what are the challenges that are preventing government from providing optimal services to the people that we're essentially here to serve. So I spent about 7, 8, 9 years in different governments. So in the Manitoba government, still in Canada, about central Canada, just for those of you that are outside the country as a point of reference, looking at how we can improve the ways that services are delivered to do a couple of things. Number one, to make sure that we're being better stewards of public coffers and that we're safeguarding that money in a more strategic, efficient, and better way. And number two, to enhance the outcomes and the programs or the policies that are essentially there for the people that we're serving. So I started getting really involved in social finance, actually, first and foremost. So while I was in the Government of Manitoba in Central Canada, I delivered one of Canada's first few landmark social impact bonds. So that was at the time seen as a strategic tool of social finance, i.e. also by association, social innovation. And so that sought to diversify the way that social services are funded by bringing in non-traditional partners in the private and non-for-profit sectors to try to fund certain outcomes through a service provider. And government was very much on the periphery of that arrangement. And the idea was that the communities are in the best position to deliver services since their ears are essentially closest to the ground. And government would be there to set some general parameters, but we would have investors get involved and fund certain interventions. And then government would say, well, I'll repay those investments if and when you can prove that you've reached a certain outcome. So the enticing part for investors that were interested in funding social outcomes was that they could make a small return on their investment, ranging anywhere between 3 to 5%, usually globally, specifically in Canada, about 3.5%. So that was part of the enticing sort of aspect in all of that. But also by having more presence and involvement from people outside of government, so funders and community organizations, the idea was that they could also influence the program design and lead to better outcomes. So that was how I started kind of dabbling a little bit in social innovation and specifically social finance. From there on out, I realized that I really like this pursuit to do things differently in government, who are plagued with all sorts of wicked policy problems, and they can't really do it alone. So I got together with a couple of colleagues and we had established Manitoba's first, so this was the provincial government at that time, the first social innovation office. And that is where we essentially would put all sorts of initiatives that are a departure from the classical way that government would do business. So that would be all of our strategic work with social enterprises to try to improve outcomes, all of the social outcomes and social impact bond work, all sorts of interesting funding mechanisms, and then sort of some different iterations and ways that we would overcome obstacles by employing different methodologies that I'll talk to you about, hopefully, a little bit later on. So I done that for a while, was really interested in sort of looking at how innovation is done in product service delivery, so outside of government. So I ended up sort of transitioning for a couple of years and doing some product innovation in the private sector, in financial services to be exact. I worked for a company that has its roots both in Canada and the US. And so I had kind of seen what the other side was like. So I spent some time leading an innovation lab, which was very much off to the side of the organization as opposed to being more entrenched within the fabric of the actual company. And I learned a lot about product innovation. Essentially, the human element wasn't a pivotal part of that the way that it was in government when we worked on social innovation, no surprise. And so I realized very quickly through that process that I love innovation in as far as there's a human element. So I transitioned back to government. And so the Canada's East Coast had always really fascinated me. And so this opportunity came my way. And so here I am. And so as you've mentioned, the title is Director of Innovation, Strategic Innovation and Design. So we are a consultancy service that provides assistance and de-risks business models with other departments that we serve in government. And we would employ various methodologies to help them sort of resolve big issues that they're grappling with. And we would provide them support with designing various workshops, leading various facilitation sessions, and just helping them sort of institute more capacity. So the idea is, instead of innovation living sort of in one area, we would work with them and build their capacity so they can actually start implementing and incorporating the tools that we would use to work with them, and do it long after we're gone and long after we've completed the project. So that's been really interesting and eye-opening, and it's very much a different sort of approach to innovation compared to the private sector lab that I spoke about just a few minutes ago. So that is where I'm right now, and being exposed to all sorts of interesting problems and employing all sorts of interesting tools, innovative tools and other tools as well to help resolve issues. Because of course, innovation isn't the panacea to all social ills. It's just one set of mechanisms that can be deployed amongst a variety. And actually, I would argue that it works best when it's complemented by other methods as well, because a lot of them do work very well and in unison, including process improvement, for instance.
And getting back to the just really the word innovation, and you mentioned you're drawn to innovation that has kind of a people element to it. Can you speak to that and what innovation looks like? Because when we talk about innovation, sometimes on the podcast, it can mean different things to different people and in different settings. What does innovation look like for you as it applies to the individuals that it pertains to and that you serve?
Yeah, that's a great question. Well, I think public or private sector or non-for-profit, regardless, I think to me, innovation is doing cool stuff that matters. Mm-hmm. I think that's ultimately what we try to create, is we try to work on interesting things that make a difference and that matter in the lives of the individuals that we collaborate with, the public that we serve, the people that we're there to represent, government proper, right? In the private sector, it's of course with respect to our customers and shareholders. So it's doing that cool stuff that really matters and that's interesting and that makes us want to come back and get up over and over and over again. But I was speaking to a couple of experts on innovation engineering in particular a few years ago when I was getting some of my certifications and designations in innovation. And they explained it to me in a way that really resonated. And they said, why don't we look at innovation in terms of creating something that's really meaningfully unique? Right? MU is the formula, MU squared. meaningfully unique. So essentially it's meaningful in the sense that it persuades people and it creates some sort of a pull, right? It's meaningful in the sense that it resolves a profound problem or issue or obstacle for the people that we're working with. And so it's unique in the sense that there's really nothing quite like it out there. So it's not like you're taking a solution or a product that already exists and you're seeking to improve it. You're being really divergent and you're creating something that's net new. So it's unique in that sense. And it also gets you noticed as a team, as an individual, as a group that's working on creating meaningfully unique solutions to something. So to me, that really spoke a lot because I could apply that to public sector innovation, and I could apply it similarly to innovation in the private sector. And I think it's really transferable, and I think it's also practical when we look at it and categorize it in that way.
Yeah, I think those are both definitions, yours and the one you had just said. Beautiful, descriptions of what innovation is. And just kind of piggybacking off of that, what does social innovation and innovation kind of look like throughout Canada? I know you had talked about being in Manitoba before going to New Brunswick. What are the differences there in social innovation? How's that kind of spread out?
Yeah, great question. So, everybody is talking about innovation now, right? It's kind of like, it's a trophy, right? It's like having a big trophy. Everybody wants to stand next to it. Everybody wants to claim that they won the trophy, that they're doing it, that they're working towards it. Canadian context aside, and New Brunswick and Manitoba context aside, just, at a general level, I think we all love to claim that we're being innovative and working towards it. I think a lot of folks are, public, private, non-for-profit. Certainly, I think a lot of us have been pushed to be more innovative, with the global context being what it is right now. But I do want to have a disclaimer and say just really quickly that corporate innovation and innovation generally is really hard. And as much as we love to claim that we're doing it and that we're being extremely innovative and we have labs and spaces dedicated to innovation, I think that it's a really complex uphill battle. And in the 10 plus years that I've spent working on innovation in the public and private sectors, I've seldom seen it done executed in a perfect way, because it follows so many ebbs and flows, and it depends at what period in time you're looking at it. So I think that should definitely kind of be distinguished. But I think where I see it working in the best way possible is when you see that openness and mentality and that propensity towards innovation, both top down. So starting with your senior most executives, your leadership team, and their openness to want to truly be disruptive and innovative, to truly question the status quo, but also at the bottom up level, right? So you've got the top down, eliminating the roadblocks and creating space for us to hold space towards innovation, and then folks that are executing the programs, policy folks that have their hands in the nitty-gritty of the everyday, that have their ears closest to the ground, also working to complement what's happening with the executives and doing the same thing and having space to present their innovative ideas, because everybody's innovative at the end of the day. You don't have to have fancy certificates. All you have to do is have the tools and openness and support from the organization to think differently about resolving a given issue that you're grappling with. So from that bottom up level, it's really having the space to share those ideas and having the practical tools to be able to execute them, and having the support from decision makers, middle management, from leadership to be able to explore that. So really what happens is you've got the top down and the bottom up working to create that space for innovation, and they work and they move together slowly until they finally meet in the middle. And that's your sweet spot. That's the place in which I think magic happens. And that's where I see organizations really doing amazing things when it comes to it. Back to your question around the differences between what the two levels of government provincially here in Canada have done. I think in Manitoba, I've been a little bit removed from it. It's been a few years since I've gone, but I think the focus on innovation, on social innovation there is really building capacity within the community and letting the community design and deliver and inform how government should do business, air quotes, right? And that's really great to see. I see a lot of focus on social finance as a key mechanism and tool to execute social innovation. The way that I feel about that is that it's certainly one tool in the proverbial toolkit, but it's not the only tool. And I think I'm really curious to see the direction in which Manitoba moves when it comes to social innovation generally, and to see if they take a departure from social finance only as an innovative tool and move into a broader pool, or if that remains their focus. In contrast with New Brunswick, it's a little bit more of a holistic approach where many different tools and methods are being considered. So it's not, the focus isn't just on that financial piece and diversifying the way that we demonstrate return on investment, or rather social return on investment in this context. And it's more of a broader encompassing conversation that looks at, okay, are we being customer centric? Are we being employee centric? And putting that CX and EX, employee experience, at the center of everything that we pursue, every problem that we're dealing with. And I find that refreshing and very much more macro focused, I guess, and it creates more space to employ various tools to get to an outcome that we're not married to, that we may not know we want to end up in. So I guess not as much of a focus on that financial and the dollars and cents piece. So that's been really interesting. I know that Alberta, the government of Alberta, has done really amazing things, and they've created incubators and accelerators that lead way to amazing social innovations. And they also really rely on the community to help inform the direction that they're taking when it comes to de-risking policy issues. So those are some examples of what I've seen in Canada, but of course there's so many other global examples that we could hone in on. I'm not sure we have the time today.
The Arkansas Inc. podcast provides an in-depth look at the latest industry trends in Arkansas from decision makers, business leaders, and executives. The Arkansas Inc. podcast has focused on a range of business and economic development topics, including small business and entrepreneurship, international business, fintech, workforce development, and community development. Each episode, which are about 30 minutes long, features business leaders and subject matter experts in conversation with knowledgeable members of the AEDC team. Recent guests have included Governor Asa Hutchinson, UAMS Chancellor Dr. Cam Patterson, Conductor Managing Director Dr. Jeff Standridge, and representatives from companies including Amazon, Walmart, IBM, Ozark Integrated Circuits, and more. The goal of the podcast is to help provide more information about Arkansas and its strong business environment, to help business owners and executives make the decision to move to or expand in Arkansas. The Arkansas Inc. podcast is available on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, and other podcast apps. Just search for Arkansas Inc. To learn more or subscribe to Arkansas Inc. podcast, visit arkansasedc.com/podcast.
Can you kind of expand on some of the other methodologies to use when you go about social innovation, maybe other than social finance? I know you mentioned accelerators, incubators, stuff like that. Does that fall under that category?
Yeah, so in New Brunswick, our model right now is we're essentially, I would say, more of an incubator than an accelerator. So we work to sort of take social issues and problems, and we sort of like keep them in a really confined space. And I think when you see it, an incubator accelerator combination, really, I think it's, in my opinion, sort of the best way forward, but it takes a lot of resources and a lot of kind of thinking through how to design that in a perfect way. So it depends. I think for methodologies, one that you see very commonly, or that I see in the social innovation context, is human-centered design. So this really, as I said just a few moments ago, puts that CX, that customer centricity. And in government terms, a customer isn't necessarily, a paying customer outside. That's the way that you would see it in the private sector. It's essentially the recipient of the social service that you're offering or that you're delivering as a public sector organization. So you're putting that customer or that member of the public at the center of your design. And so it involves that human perspective in every step of the way, especially as you're developing a solution to the problem that's being pondered. So in human-centered design, without getting into it too much, it's got 3 basic stages. So you're being inspired, you're spending time in the inspiration space, you're ideating, you're creating ideas to resolve the issue at hand, and then you're spending some time together with your customers implementing that. So that's really popular. It's not the only method, but it's certainly a prevalent one that we either use in its entirety or we pick and choose pieces of it and combine it with other methodologies, such as innovation engineering. So I myself am a black belt innovation engineer. So that is sort of my discipline, and that's what I focused in on. I use that a lot in the private sector. It's more popular in industry and where you see more production. So it's certainly more of a private sector methodology. It is more similar to process improvement in the sense that it employs a more practical method of solving problems. So it certainly always looks to the customer centricity as the most integral part, but it also kind of looks at how do we spend time being more efficient as opposed to pondering the issue and creating space to ponder something a little bit longer, the way that we might under human-centered design. So it has its roots, as I said, in process improvement. It was coined by Dr. Deming, for those of you that might be process improvement gurus. So that was a huge influencer there. And so, yeah, it's just more of a common sense approach and sort of has a defined beginning and a defined middle and a defined end, in contrast to maybe some other methods in government that you might see that are a little bit more open-ended. So there's no right or wrong. I think they both work depending on the context, and they also can complement each other. And the third one that I have used often that I would certainly vouch for are the Google design sprints. So that's sort of not different from the other 2 that I mentioned. The most interesting part in Google design sprints is, okay, so it was born out of Silicon Valley, right? And again, underpinnings in product and tech specifically, but it takes a really monumental issue and it resolves it in a really, really short amount of time. So I think from beginning to end, if you have all of your stakeholders around the table, you can resolve something in 5 days. And so when you look at that through a government lens or a public sector lens, where we're dealing with very complex systems types of issues that involve transformations and systems change, looking at identifying a problem and resolving it by having some tested prototypes in an MVP at the end of day 5, so within a week, a working week, it starts to look really enticing and almost hard to believe, but it is interesting. It can work in the right context, right? It's one. So what it does is you're empathizing. You're spending all day empathizing with your customers, your clients. You're defining the issue. You're ideating. You're prototyping, and you're testing all throughout. So it's a very, very iterative process. And I think, you know, the way that I work best in my role as Director of Strategic Innovation and Design is that I like to expose my clients and my customers to bits and pieces of each one of those. So we seldom ever use each one of those in its entirety, perfectly following step 1 to 10. I think that's really where you can get creative and think outside the box, is when you think, okay, human-centered design does this really well. I'm going to take that and then combine it with day 3 of what Google design sprints would do. And sort of what it does is you end up with a unique formula that, you know, you've generated yourself that usually isn't replicated, but that you can pick and choose from. So those are some methodologies that I would probably use commonly within the public and private sector, and they worked really, really well for me.
And so
Thank you.
During your time, you know, in New Brunswick or Manitoba, I'd be interested to hear maybe even kind of anecdotally a little bit, maybe a story you could share of wherein those methodologies worked. You have a success story or like a policy win, I think our listeners would be interested in kind of hearing some of those, like maybe an anecdote of something like that.
Yeah, so I think, again, it's not the methodologies that have led to success, and there have been quite a few successes on both recent projects within the New Brunswick context, and certainly in my private sector experience, as well as within Manitoba. But I would move us away from those successes being attributed to the methodologies, and more of the cultural elements that gave way to that success. So what I mean by that is, wherever I embarked upon a project where that individual's leader allowed them the space and the time in their workday to focus on being playful and being disruptive and being divergent and employing new methods of overcoming risk or de-risking a model, those are the ones that have led usually to the most success. And I think it's really interesting because, again, back to what I said at the outset when we started, everybody likes to say that they're being innovative and that they're doing cool stuff that matters, right? And that, they're on to the next shiny thing. But really where that shows is whenever we see leaders in the organization creating space for those employees to spend time in there. So that means building it into the strategic plan at the very top of the organization. So you want to create success and come out on top in the eyes of your competitors and be seen as having a superior product, or you want to come on top as being the most efficient and the most forward-looking public sector organization. Great, build it into your strategy and make sure that those underpinnings trickle down into individual work plans. So that way, at the end of the year, you're not just saying, well, innovation was great. We really tried to focus on it. We dabbled in it, but really we ran out of time. If it's in the strategy, if it trickles down into the work plan, what happens is you're being, in a very explicit way, evaluated on that. And in the private sector, your bonus depends on it. In the public sector, you're paid a lot of your success hinges on it, and we're putting our money where our mouth is. So I think that those are the spaces where I see the most creativity. Those are the biggest success stories, in my opinion.
I think too, there's kind of, I've seen the past 3 years here at Startup Junkie, there's kind of like almost a generational shift as it pertains to social innovation. And, we would do a lot of work with the university and students out of the university. There's just a budding interest in entrepreneurship and innovation, but also when you go into those classrooms and you work with those students, they're not thinking along the same traditional entrepreneurship, small business paths. They're looking at, how do we solve these social problems within our community, within our state, within our country? It's like that's their first thought out of the gate as students. Now it's become kind of like the forefront of that. And so thinking along those lines, those organizations and enterprises that do build culture, that make space for those incoming, employees, team members, as they're coming out of university and entering those organizations and those systems, it just kind of creates the perfect environment for those problems to be solved.
Well, yeah, and also it's such an integral part, social innovation generally, it works part and parcel of corporate social responsibility for a lot of organizations and companies. And I think the new wave of workers, right? Millennials, Zennials, whatever we're calling them now, I think you're right. I think we do start to see a more profound interest in attaching themselves to organizations that really execute on some of those priorities. So, and that have that embedded within their scorecards. And I think that those are the companies that are going to be leading, that are going to be seen as leaders, and the ones that are essentially attracting the most talent, because I think we just start to see more of an investment from the younger workers in making this a priority for themselves, even if they're taking a pay cut in a lot of cases, which is really interesting. It really shows that the priority is there. So I think for companies that truly encapsulate that and incorporate that into their daily operations, I think it gives them a clear advantage and a clear edge. And for governments too, I think, we start to see so many retirements as baby boomers are leaving the workplace over the next 3 to 5 to 7 years. It's going to create quite the gap. And I think governments are also starting to look at, how do we attract that younger talent? How do we get them, working for us, as opposed to the private sector where they're making 30-35% more than we were offer them? And the answer is creating the space to think outside the box, giving them alternate tools to overcome really, really large issues that I don't think governments alone in the past have been able to overcome. So I think it brings a lot of questions to light that I think many of us are asking, regardless of sector or industry.
And I asked earlier, about detailing kind of some of those successes. What do you see as some of the biggest challenges moving forward, down the road?
Yeah, I think the biggest one, in my opinion, would have to do with innovation accounting. And I'm strictly speaking from the sense of public sector organizations right now. And I think that when we're entrusted with taxpayer money, we're very diligent, as we should be, right? We want to make sure that inputs equal outputs equal amazing outcomes. And not only that, but we want to see that happen in a timely manner. And in following political cycles, right, as we do in the public administration, we also want to make sure that the government of the day can have some great announceables and be able to demonstrate that the taxpayer money that's coming in is actually creating value and leading to certain outcomes, and that we can announce them and talk about them. The problem with doing that in a creative space where social innovation is kind of a part of it is that we can't expect to follow classical accounting methods that you would see the outputs and outcomes in 1 to 2 to 3 years, because these problems are very complex. They deal with incarceration, they deal with children and babies in state care, they deal with homelessness, they deal with complex health issues. When you employ strategic, innovative tools and methods and helping affect those to create better outcomes, you often don't see them until many, many years out, 5 to 7 to 10 plus years, depending on the issue. And I think that innovation lends itself to that kind of an outcome too. So for governments and for organizations that want to be able to respond and announce on those quick wins, right? The quick win being the imperative word, we can't really, it fractures and it interferes with the innovation process that only really truly actualizes and manifests itself in some cases many years out. So it's almost like having a degree of patience to let that process take its course. And it's often very much a longitudinal study. And I think when we follow election cycles in government and we want to have some sexy and awesome announceables, we often get in the way of what could have been an awesome outcome that employed innovation, because it doesn't provide those quick outputs in the time frame that we might expect. So the biggest challenge is organizations sitting down and generating specific innovation metrics and innovation accounting methods and adopting them and getting some buy-in from senior leadership to be able to be okay if those don't manifest in, in that quick turnaround time. To me, that's been the biggest challenge, certainly in government, but also in the private sector as well. Everybody wants great outcomes that we can talk about really quickly, right? And patience is so center to what we're talking about here. That would be for sure one thing for me that stands out.
I think that's a problem we can empathize with as an organization that serves entrepreneurs in our region that's third-party funded, whether that's through federal, state grants or otherwise, and then having to report metrics quarterly, 3 months after you've, received those funds. Like, what can you exactly report to quantify growth and innovation and entrepreneurship really? And how can you quantify that to really show impact in a community in such a short span of time? So it's definitely a challenge across the board. So Sandra, one of the questions we ask as we quote unquote land the plane for our podcast episodes.
Are we almost landing?
Yeah, we're getting there. So we ask all of our guests, if they had the opportunity, we have a time machine, Startup Junkie time machine, and you can go back in time and visit with your younger self at whatever point, maybe right after school, or when you're before, private sector or Manitoba or whenever, and you had the opportunity, knowing what you know now, to give your younger self advice. What might that advice be?
Do you want the PC answer or the real answer that I really
Let's hear the real answer.
I wouldn't tell her a darn thing. She got me this far, didn't she? And here we are. And I am so lucky to be able to work in a space that allows me to put on my creative hat every day and work with amazing creative team members and staff and customers and clients and collaborators. And I get up with like the butterfly feeling in my stomach every morning that I get to do that. And so I think the path, like the crazy, divergent, interesting path that I took, all contributed to me getting here. So I don't know that I would do much different, professionally speaking, to be honest. And I know that sounds so cocky, and I don't know that I will say that, but it's the truth in my case.
I think that's one of the best answers we've ever had. I think only one other person has ever had something similar to that. We had a guest a couple of years ago that said, I wouldn't have said anything, because if I did, I'd be working. This was an entrepreneur. He said, if I told myself, what I was going to experience, I would have gotten a desk job somewhere and not have embarked on that journey. So, my path led me to where I needed to be. So I think that's a fantastic answer.
Great answer. Yeah, I love it.
Thank you so much.
And Sandra, for our listeners, I'm not positive, but you may be our first Startup Junkies podcast guest that we recorded live from Canada. So that's, one first there. But for our listeners in over 100 countries, including Canada, if they want to find out more about you and what you're doing, connect with you and that sort of thing, what's the best way for them to reach you?
Absolutely. Yeah. Any questions or inquiries about anything we've talked about today, or if you just want to collaborate, work together, talk about interesting ideas, you can shoot me an inquiry or an email at sandrahodzic.com. And
awesome.
Looking forward to connecting.
Yeah, absolutely. We appreciate you for joining us, and we hope to have you back on sometime soon.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. Take care.
See ya. Bye.
Bye.
Ecosystem builders, entrepreneurs, chambers of commerce, mayors. If you're interested in taking your economic future into your own hands, we've got a book that can help you. Creating Startup Junkies, Building Sustainable Venture Ecosystems in Unexpected Places is the guide. It's a little bit inspiration. It's a little bit toolkit. What it will allow you to do is take your economic future into your own hands and build a sustainable small business, innovation, and entrepreneurial ecosystem in your backyard. If you'd like to hear more, check out creatingstartupjunkies.com. The Startup Junkie podcast reaches over 100 countries and has had over 100,000 downloads. If you're interested in reaching some of the most motivated and engaged innovators and entrepreneurs on a worldwide basis, give us a shout.